Throughout history, the capture of enemy combatants in warfare has been an unfortunate constant. The treatment of these prisoners, however, has varied dramatically. In ancient times, prisoners of war often faced brutal fates. They could be slaughtered outright, enslaved, tortured, or ransomed. There was little concept of a captive's rights or dignity. This lack of formal protection led to widespread suffering and abuse. The Middle Ages saw some improvement with the emergence of chivalry. Knights were expected to treat their captives with a degree of respect, at least those of noble birth. However, common soldiers and those deemed heretics or infidels were still subject to cruelty. The Renaissance and the Enlightenment brought about a renewed focus on humanism. Yet, the treatment of POWs remained inconsistent and often depended on the whims of individual commanders or the prevailing political climate. The lack of a universal code of conduct resulted in widespread suffering and abuse. The capture of a soldier often filled both the captive and their family with dread. The fear of torture, enslavement, or a slow death in captivity was a constant shadow over the battlefields of the past. It was not until the 19th century that significant steps were taken to codify the treatment of prisoners of war. The 19th century marked a turning point in the treatment of prisoners of war. Growing international concern over the horrors of war, particularly after the carnage of the American Civil War, led to the First Geneva Convention in 1864. This landmark agreement established rules for the treatment of sick and wounded soldiers. It also laid the groundwork for future conventions that would specifically address the treatment of prisoners of war. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 further expanded upon these principles. They outlined rules for the conduct of war, including the treatment of prisoners. These conventions emphasized the need for humane treatment, prohibiting torture, forced labor, and the use of prisoners as hostages. The devastation of the First World War, with its unprecedented casualties and brutality, underscored the urgent need for a more comprehensive and enforceable international agreement on the treatment of POWs. In 1929, the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war was adopted. This convention, revised and expanded in 1949, remains the cornerstone of international law regarding the protection of prisoners of war. The Geneva Conventions of 1949, adopted in the aftermath of the Second World War, provided detailed regulations regarding the treatment of prisoners. They addressed key areas such as living conditions, labor, medical care, discipline, and repatriation. These conventions aimed to ensure that POWs were treated humanely, regardless of their nationality, rank, or the circumstances of their capture. They established the principle that prisoners of war are not criminals, but rather combatants who, having laid down their arms, are entitled to respect and protection. The Geneva Conventions represented a significant shift in international law, moving away from the historical acceptance of wartime brutality towards a more humane approach to warfare. The true test of any law lies in its enforcement, and the Geneva Conventions faced numerous challenges in the decades following their adoption. The Second World War, despite its horrors, saw instances where the conventions were upheld. For example, German POWs held by the Western Allies generally received humane treatment in accordance with the conventions. However, the conflict also witnessed egregious violations such as the horrific treatment of Soviet POWs by Nazi Germany and the mistreatment of Allied prisoners by Japan. The Cold War, despite not escalating into a global conflict, also saw its share of POW-related issues. The Korean War, with its ideological divisions and brutal fighting, witnessed atrocities committed by both sides. The Vietnam War further highlighted the challenges of upholding the Geneva Conventions in the context of guerrilla warfare. The conflict saw the mistreatment of POWs by both North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, as well as by some elements within the US military. These conflicts demonstrated that while the Geneva Conventions provided a crucial legal framework, their effectiveness depended on the willingness of states to abide by their provisions. They also highlighted the challenges of enforcing international law in the midst of complex and brutal conflicts. Despite these challenges, the Geneva Conventions have undoubtedly had a positive impact on the treatment of prisoners of war. They have established a global norm of humane treatment and provided a legal framework for holding perpetrators of war crimes accountable. However, the 21st century has brought about new and complex challenges to the protection of prisoners of war. The rise of non-state actors, the increasing use of unconventional warfare, and the changing nature of conflict zones all pose significant threats to the safety and well-being of captured combatants. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine is a stark reminder of the fragility of international law and the persistent threat to the humane treatment of prisoners of war. Reports of torture, extrajudicial killings, and the use of human shields are deeply concerning and underscore the need for continued international pressure and accountability. It is imperative that the international community remains vigilant in upholding the principles enshrined in the Geneva Conventions. We must ensure that all parties to a conflict understand their obligations and are held accountable for any violations. The protection of prisoners of war is not merely a legal obligation, it is a moral imperative. It is a testament to our shared humanity and our commitment to a world where even in the darkest of times, the principles of dignity, respect, and compassion prevail.